history of the conflict with which we are all extremely familiar. Economic, political, diplomatic, the media, all of these areas. In all of these areas, the Monroe Doctrine can be felt. It's ideological, political, ideological, and it is all directed against our land, our homeland, our very raison d'etre. Why political, economic, diplomatic aggression, attacks on Venezuela? Because we wanted to defend our autonomy, we wanted our democratic revolution, our social democracy. We wanted to have our own new model of what society we wanted. We wanted to defend the identity of our country. We wanted to preserve our own culture, our own Latin American culture. And we had been developing our revolutionary project for 20 years. And this is the struggle of our people and in our region. Perhaps, more understandably, for geopolitical global reasons, Venezuela is the one country in the world that has oil reserves that have been determined to be the largest at the international level. Venezuela founded OPEC. It's been producing oil for 100 years, and it has produced and it has been certified as having the largest oil reserves in the world. It has its natural resources, its natural wealth, and our country, according to international standards, may also have the largest gold reserves in the world. So in addition to the largest oil reserves, we also could have the largest gold reserves in the world, and this is according to international certification. And we also have the fourth largest gas reserves in the world. These are major natural resources of geopolitical and economic and strategic interest. And this has led to the oligarchs in the continent who dominate from Washington. This has led them to try to control power in Venezuela. The Venezuelan economy has been subjected to a number of unilateral actions over the last few years. Illegal actions. This has been economic persecution of us. We have not been able to use the international currency of the US dollar, and this has been an attempt by the Treasury of the United States to stop us using the dollar, and today we cannot use the dollar in any international transaction. And this has been economic and trade and monetary persecution of Venezuela. And Venezuela has been subjected to economic sanctions as well. And these are illegal unilateral sanctions imposed on us. The US President yesterday, from this very rostrum, spoke of new sanctions, further sanctions, so-called sanctions, economic and financial sanctions against my country. And he said that here, the sanctuary of international law, here, but he spoke of illegal sanctions, imposing his will, financial persecution of Venezuela. It is illegal from the standpoint of international law. And we are also being attacked constantly in the media This was an attempt to justify an international interference or intervention, which might have been an attempt at a military intervention in our country. And this was action that was going to be taken against our country, supposedly to prevent a humanitarian crisis. And this was an attempt by the US government and its satellite allies in Latin America to get its hands on our country. And a migration crisis has now been invented, and it, of its own weight, is falling, is collapsing. If you want to look at the real migration crisis in the world, you can look at this situation in Central America, in Mexico, and there's been talk of building a war, building a wall against our people, and double standards are being imposed. Because when you talk about Caribbean, Latin American migrants who are being prosecuted and persecuted along the border with Mexico, families are being split up and separated and divided. There's a double standard. The migration crisis is indeed a serious issue. And there was the destruction of Libya by NATO, and that led to migration by thousands and thousands, in fact millions of Africans. And also there have been so many migrants because of the war in Syria. And now their world media is trying to fabricate a migration crisis in Venezuela to justify what was perhaps being called a humanitarian intervention, in quotation marks. Look at what happened to Iraq. And they have justified intervention in other countries as well, through a brutal psychological kind of warfare. And we have suffered from this as well. We have also been attacked diplomatically. Dear brothers and sisters of governments and peoples throughout the world, there have been direct threats, cutting off aid, withdrawing aid from the United States, or blocking aid to international support institutions or to help countries that need help. We have listened to statements being made. There are countries asking for better mechanisms to ensure full funding for development. And this is something that our peoples are entitled to. From this very rostrum, a threat was issued yesterday to governments of the world that orders should be obeyed and the US policy should be followed, or else those countries would suffer from the consequences. And so there has been a fierce diplomatic attack, offensive, so to speak, against Venezuela in many fora of the United Nations, supported by satellite allies and countries. Venezuela has been subjected to constant attacks. The New York Times in September published an article talking about participation by members of the White House and people in the US administration with people in Venezuela talking about how to bring about a coup in Venezuela, a regime change in Venezuela. This was published by the New York Times. It was taken up by the journal Time. It was taken up by the Washington Post and indeed in the world press. And this is just further evidence of the ongoing attacks by the US against our country, against our democracy in Venezuela. We have been able to reject attempts to bring about violence and coups and violent protests. We have been able to deal with such attacks against us in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. After the failure, which was reported in the New York Times, of attempts to create disturbances and violence and military offensives